Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday the 2nd of November and I'm Andrew Wilson. This is Scotland at 7. This evening we're broadcasting from our studios in Kirkcaldy and I'm delighted to say that we're joined this evening by Linda Fabiani. Linda was the MSP for East Kilbride and during her long career at Holyrood she was also the Deputy Presiding Officer. However, she was lucky enough to have good time off for good behaviour and retired from our Parliament after 20 years of service in May earlier this year. What we'll do is I'll have the coronavirus update for you and then we will have a look at some of today's news headlines, and then in a departure from our normal or our more usual format for the programme, we'll have a longer conversation looking at a number of the topics that have arisen yesterday and today at the COP26 conference, which is taking place here in Glasgow, and I'll be discussing them with Linda and also I hope with Ferrer, Gotić, who will be joining us a little later on in the programme. But firstly, we have the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,433,025 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,785,336 have been confirmed negative and 647,689 have tested positive. There are 2,010 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will be tested, will display symptoms, and not everyone with symptoms will be tested. There are 26 new reported deaths today of people who have tested positive for COVID. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,189. This number only includes those who have died, having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of those who had tested positive, 932 were in hospital last night, 63 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,320,370 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,910,253 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 140,964 patients who had tested positive for COVID have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 149 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. We also have an update from the Office of National Statistics this evening. As of the 2nd of November, the number of deaths from all causes in the UK for the week ending the 22nd of October 2021 was 12,935, and that is 15.4% above the average for the corresponding week in the years between 2015 and 2019. Deaths were above the 5-year average in all of the UK nations. Of all deaths registered in the week ending the 22nd of October, 974 involved coronavirus. That's 82 more than in the previous week. That's a 9.2% increase. Deaths involving COVID-19 accounted for around 1 in 13 deaths, about 7.5% of all deaths in that week. Now, as I say, we'll have a quick look at today's news headlines. I'll read through them and then we will have a much longer discussion in greater detail around a number of issues and a number of the talking points which have arisen as the COP26 conference has started in Glasgow. But firstly, dozens of people have been killed and wounded as blasts and gunfire hit a hospital in Kabul earlier today. At least 25 people were killed and more than 50 wounded when gunmen attacked Afghanistan's biggest military hospital after 2 heavy explosions at the site in central Kabul. The explosions hit the entrance of the 400-bed Sardar Mohammed Daud Khan hospital and were followed with an assault by a group of Islamic State gunmen, all of whom were killed within 15 minutes, a Taliban spokesman said. He said that Taliban special forces dropped by helicopter had prevented the attackers from entering the hospital itself, with all killed at the entrance or in the courtyard. The blasts add to a growing list of attacks and killings since the Taliban completed their victory over the Western-backed government in August, undermining their claim to have restored security to Afghanistan after decades of war. There was no immediate claim of responsibility, but the operation was typical of the complex attacks mounted by Islamic State. It follows a string of bombings by the group, which has emerged as the biggest threat to Taliban control in Afghanistan. The British fishing vessel, which has been impounded in France, is still held there, according to the owner. The Canadian-owned British-registered scallop dredger, which was seized by France, is being held at the port of Le Havre, the owner of the ship said earlier today, though French President Emmanuel Macron had stepped back from slapping immediate sanctions on Britain in this post-Brexit fishing row. Bickering over the fish between London and Paris culminated last Wednesday in the French seizure of the dredger, the Cornelis Gert-Jan, in French waters near Le Havre. As far as we are aware, the vessel remains held at the port of Le Havre, at least until the hearing tomorrow, Andrew Brown, who's a director of Macduff Shellfish, which owns the vessel, told Reuters. Earlier, the British Environment Secretary George Eustace said he understood the vessel had been freed from France. However, a spokesman later said that Mr. Eustace had misspoken. BP has said that it has added more than $1 billion to its share buyback programme on Tuesday as it likened itself to a cash machine, benefiting from higher oil and gas prices and a strong trading performance as a result in the third quarter. Natural gas and power prices around the world surged as tight gas supplies collided with strong demand in economies recovering from the pandemic. BP said it expected natural gas prices to remain strong, in its words, in the coming months of peak winter demand. The company is a cash machine of these sorts of oil and gas prices, and the business is running very well, the chief executive Bernard Looney told Reuters. Underlying replacement cost profit, that's BP's definition of its net earnings, reached $3.32 billion in the third quarter, exceeding analysts' expectations. That compares with $2.8 billion in profit for the second quarter and $86 million a year earlier, when energy demand was lower and prices had collapsed because of the pandemic. The results were boosted by very strong trading, which helped BP weather the large fluctuations in gas and liquefied natural gas prices throughout the quarter. We'll be returning to BP and other energy majors, as you would expect, in the conversation with regard to COP later on in the programme. The American chief executive of Barclays Bank, Jez Staley, is stepping down with immediate effect, following an investigation by British regulators into his relationship with disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein, the bank said yesterday. The investigation by the Financial Conduct Authority and the Bank of England's Prudential Regulation Authority was disclosed by Barclays in early 2020 and focused on how Staley had characterised his relationship to Epstein. Barclays and Staley were made aware on Friday evening by the FCA and the Prudential Regulation Authority of the preliminary conclusions of their investigation. And in view of those conclusions and Mr. Staley's intention to contest them, the board of Barclays and Mr. Staley agreed that he will step down from his role as Group Chief Executive and as a Director of Barclays, the bank said in a statement. It should be noted that the investigation makes no findings that Mr. Staley saw or was aware of any of Mr. Epstein's alleged crimes, which was the central question underpinning Barclays' support for Mr. Staley following the arrest of Mr. Epstein in the summer of 2019, the bank added, saying it was not appropriate for it to comment further. Staley has been running Barclays since 2015. Prior to that, he worked for more than 30 years at JP Morgan, where he served as head of its investment banking division. His relationship with Epstein dated back to the year 2000, when he became head of JP Morgan's private bank. And we may well be returning to discussing JP Morgan later in the programme this evening as well. And in Scottish news this afternoon and this evening, MPs have called for a U-turn on the carbon capture decision by the Westminster government. The SNP has called for the UK government to U-turn on its decision to scrap investment in Scotland's carbon capture project as a cross-party group of Scottish MPs meet with the UK Government Minister for Energy, Greg Hands, today. As world leaders discuss climate pledges here in Glasgow, Ian Blackford MP said, "Leadership on climate change must begin at home. The SNP's Westminster leader said the investment is vital to meeting Scotland's climate pledges and the promises made to Scotland in 2014. Commenting, Ian Blackford MP said, "The eyes of the world are on Scotland as we hope and demand that political leaders deliver the radical action needed to tackle climate change and protect our planet. It is inexplicable that the Tory government took this decision when Scottish businesses and MPs of every party agree funding Scotland's CCS project is absolutely essential. And given the huge energy sector expertise in Scotland, I urge the Prime Minister to put his money where his mouth is and urgently deliver investment for the carbon capture scheme." And the Chancellor has been challenged to maintain the VAT reduction for tourism and hospitality businesses. The SNP has challenged the Chancellor to maintain the reduced VAT rate for struggling hospitality and tourism businesses right through next year at the very least. The call comes as the UK government is set to increase the VAT rate to the pre-pandemic level of 20%, up from the temporary 12.5% as it currently is. The SNP's Alison Thulis has warned that businesses are already facing a tough winter due to rising fuel, staffing and supply costs, and the move to increase the VAT rate could push many over the brink. Commenting, the SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thulis MP said, "Tourism and hospitality businesses are facing a tough winter with rising fuel, staffing and supply costs. The COVID pandemic has dealt a heavy blow to many in the industry, pushing them into financial hardship and debt. It is critical that the UK government takes the necessary steps to protect businesses at this time and not prematurely pull support from under their feet. Maintaining the 12.5% VAT rate right through next year, not putting it up to 20%, would bring much needed financial breathing space and relief for our hospitality and tourism businesses." And finally, with this brief review of the news, the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has joined other UK First Ministers and the Prime Minister for a breakfast summit earlier today. Nicola Sturgeon joined Boris Johnson and the First Ministers of Wales and Northern Ireland to host a breakfast summit with other world leaders at COP26. The meeting was attended by around 40 leaders, including the Belgian Prime Minister Mia Mottley, whose speech in the conference's opening ceremony drew praise, and also Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. Speaking at the reception, our First Minister urged world leaders to take action to make sure that the eyes of history judge us fairly. She said that the industrial past of Glasgow confers a particular responsibility to help lead the world into the net zero age. Following the meeting, Ms Sturgeon said Glasgow has the opportunity to be a city which helps propel the world into the net zero age. Given our industrial past, an industrial past shared by not all but many of the countries represented here today, we also have a particular responsibility to help lead the world into the net zero age. As leaders here, you have that weight of responsibility on your shoulders. We all bear that weight of responsibility to come out of this summit with a credible pathway to net zero, so that we do have the ability to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but to do that in a way that is fair and just and recognises the responsibility of developed countries to developing countries. So that's a brief review of this evening's news headlines. And what we will do for the rest of this special programme this evening is begin to look at a number of the topics and the issues which have arisen in the news, and as a result of the discussions and the negotiations which have begun at the COP26 conference being held in Glasgow since yesterday, and which will go on for the next 11 days. And I'm delighted to have Linda Fabiani joining me this evening in order to have a conversation around a number of these topics and a number of these issues. So Linda, good evening. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine, thank you very much. Sun was shining today.
Well, it's fantastic to see you, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to join us this evening to have this first longer conversation in connection with the events that we know are taking place not very far away from where we are in Cowcaddens at the moment. So first of all, what's your we've had 2 days of COP26 after 2 years of build-up. So it's as a starter for 10, and having just spoken a moment ago about the First Minister's comments following her breakfast meeting with world leaders earlier today, what's your overall impression of how COP26 has started?
Interesting. Yeah, do you know, I drove into Glasgow on, Friday, I think it was. Yes, Friday evening to meet some friends that were delegates from across the world. And you could see the preparations really getting up and running on Friday. Impossible to get close to the exhibition centre, for example, and the town was quite busy. But of course, I've kept away since then, because I thought, when all the major players started to arrive over the weekend and then on Monday, that's when it really seemed to come to peak frenzy and excitement. So I think it seems to be going fairly well. Of course, there's been issues. I know that some of the residents round about Finnieston have had a really hard time, for example. There seems to be a bit of frustration about some of the protests going on, people feeling they're adversely affected. But there's been a lot of lovely moments as well. I thought to see young Greta Thunberg arrive, and the way she was welcomed by so many young people and the population in general was great. To hear the stories of how delegates are finding Glasgow a very friendly place, I think is also heartwarming. So yeah, I think it started well. I was delighted to see the Greenpeace ship come up the Clyde. And there was a lovely piece I saw on social media last night. I can't remember who it was arriving on their fairly small boat. And there was a school of porpoises greeted them in the firth. Just I could see Hunterson in the distance. So it was lovely. I think all in all it's been a good feeling. But we're right at the start, and I hope that sustains.
Thank you. No, that's absolutely right. The first thing I was going to talk about, it struck me this morning, there was an announcement from the Norwegian government, who are here, saying that Norway will double its climate financing contribution, reiterating the Norwegian government's commitment to reducing its emissions and helping others to reduce theirs. The Norwegian Prime Minister said, "We come to Glasgow with 3 firm commitments. First, we will follow up on the invitation by our British hosts. We are ready to double our climate financing contribution to more than $1.6 billion per year by 2026. He then said that Norway would work with the development partners to help with renewable energy transition and to phase out coal, as well as launching a new climate investment initiative to help fund renewable energy in developing countries. Second, to work with business, industry and social partners to help us all succeed towards a renewable, circular and sustainable future," he said. And then finally, he insisted that the financial sector must play its part and announced that the Norwegian Public Pension Fund would take the lead in responsible investment, basing its work on an overall long-term goal of net zero emissions from the companies in which it invests. The Norwegian Prime Minister concluded, "We cannot allow the inaction of some to be an argument for failing to take action by the rest of us. Now is the time to step up." And it struck me that it was an interesting comparison from a Scottish perspective, to be seeing what a comparable sized country like Norway, with in some senses a similar economy, to see what it was that they were able to announce this morning, and to demonstrate the agency and the ability that smaller countries, especially the smaller countries with very large sovereign oil funds, can do to help. So did anything strike you with regard to the 3 points that the Norwegian Prime Minister was making this morning?
Well, I think, Andrew, these are big commitments. And good for Norway. I think it's absolutely super. But not hugely surprising for many reasons. I mean, when you look at the small independent countries that make up Scandinavia, historically, often led by Norway, have a very, very good record on the social responsibility, not just to their own people and to their neighbours, but to those across the world who are less fortunate in a stage of development. For I have a memory that Norway, I think it was one of the first to reach 1% of GDP for international development some years ago. And there was a lot of campaigning by many of us here in Scotland to have the UK step up the same. So I think it's excellent what they're doing. They're really setting the mark. What the Premier has said is quite right. You don't take the excuse that, well, if not everybody's doing it, we're not doing it. And that applies to so many things in this world, from nuclear disarmament as the huge big one, to many, many other things. So I think it's great. Of course, that responsibility they have decided to take is made easier by, as you say, their sovereign oil fund, because they did not waste the resources that came from oil. They also have a recognition now, it would seem to me, that having been so fortunate through that, and the recognition now that, perhaps we have damaged the planet by all the extraction of that oil, and we have to change it, make it more sustainable. They're giving something back. And that is surely the way that partner countries across the world should be behaving. I know we'll get on to it later. It's perhaps the way big companies should be behaving as well.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. We know that there have been protests today in Glasgow and Edinburgh at the offices of JP Morgan. We know that green financing will be, I think, a major topic of discussion at COP26 tomorrow. We've heard about the Norwegian pension funds seeking to seeking to invest in a way that supports the move to net zero, and it struck me that perhaps Scotland that perhaps indicates to Scotland that we are in some senses we are at the nexus of the climate crisis in two ways. Firstly, we have a large carbon. We have a large oil and gas sector, and secondly, we had traditionally had a very large financial services sector, including investment funds, investment trusts, and pension funds based in Scotland. So it struck me that whilst oil and gas has been the headline, if you will, in fact, other industries which are at least as large and as important in Scotland may have a role to play too. Do you sense that there's an appetite or a growing recognition amongst the financial services sector and those organisations in Scotland and the UK that they are being expected to stop investing in developments and infrastructure opportunities which make the climate crisis worse, and they're going to have to begin to invest in green technology?
I'm not sure they're there yet. And I think a lot of that's about the way big business works in our society. When you have shareholders making big bucks, social responsibility very often goes out the window. We see it so often. We've seen it in all sorts of large companies, not just the financial sector. To use an example, some years ago, Diageo pulled out of Kilmarnock, the home of where people had worked for generations for that company. They just said, cheerio, we're out here, we can make more money elsewhere. Meanwhile, if you looked on their website, I remember it well, they had a wonderful statement about social responsibility. So you will find a lot of these companies will have excellent statements, excellent PR that says they're doing all these things. I'm sure BP have something on their website, I would imagine, about how they're going for sustainability and all the rest of it. Well, I know it's become a bit of a cliche. I heard it in the radio again today. I can't remember who said it, that, you cannot have green responsibility and sustainability without social responsibility and sustainability. And that's a fact, because those who are hit hardest, whether nationally or internationally, are those without resources. They are the poorest. So I think a lot of these companies will talk a good game. I think it's a while yet before they really put any action behind it. And it is up to governments to lead the way. Now, that's what Norway seems to be doing, that small independent nation, roughly the same size as Scotland. They seem to be leading the way. Good on them. And I hope that their neighbouring Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, also small independent countries, will join them in that. Because this is something that's said very often, that Scotland as an independent nation would be totally isolated. Of course we wouldn't. Stop being ridiculous. We would work with our neighbours. You just have to look at Norway, Sweden and Denmark, Scandinavian. They have all sorts of joint operations and they talk all the time and they do a lot of things together. So it looks like the Scandinavian nations are going to be leading some of this, as so often. I think Scotland could be a leader in that too, in so many ways. In fact, I think our own First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, announced extra international development funding that would go for climate change.
Yep.
Now, that's in addition to what we contribute to the UK efforts.
Yes.
So yes, the will is there in Scotland. I just wish we had the power to be able to do these things properly and join the likes of Norway in leading the way. Because somebody's got to lead the way.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the more that we can join together and work together to lead the way, the better. And I think small independent nations are very, very well placed to do that.
Thanks, Linda. A number of interesting points that you make there. One thing that certainly struck me, you were talking there about companies with their corporate social responsibility statements and their green statements, whether or not they were being good at talking the talk, but may or may not be so good at walking the walk. I suspect that's a concern and observation that's directed also at a number of our political leaders. In the context, in particular, of COP26. And so, do you think the companies feel compelled to have to greenwash themselves, to use a terrible word, and are required by law to make, depending on the size of the company, to make statements and have policies on corporate social responsibility? Do you think it's about time that we start holding certain politicians to account in a similar kind of way, expecting them to do more than simply talk the talk and actually expecting them to walk the walk?
Yes, I do. But it's also that thing back to what the Norwegian Premier said was, it's no excuse to say they're not doing it, so we're not doing it either. Somebody has to lead. Now, what we've heard so often, for example, is, well, look at China, the amount of coal they're extracting, and if they're not going to do anything, why should we? Yes, that's right. I mean, China's actions are pretty grim. Of course they are. But that doesn't mean everyone else should give up. You have to start making sustainability, that buzzword, you have to start making sustainability and saving our planet for future generations priority, and also what most people are doing. Because it's only when most people are doing it that can then force the hand of others. Now, we do hear even some of our own politicians talking the talk. The carbon capture facility, for example, being promised and then pulled back from Scotland is a case in point of that. And we hear it far too often. I mean, look at Boris Johnson. No, I'd rather not look at Boris Johnson, come to think of it.
You're not alone in that, I suspect.
I would have said that, is it true that he's flying down to London and then flying back while COP is on? How can he not get the train? It's ludicrous.
We will come to that, but it's a very good point that you make. The performative nature of some people's politics, and the lack of substance, and the substance point also, I think, comes into the other point you were making, which really relates to the clear need for what I think some politicians and the First Minister refer to as a just transition. You were talking about Diageo withdrawing from Kilmarnock in a not very just way from the perspective of the former employees, and I think we all know that the First Minister says that her political outlook and her political perspective was shaped by the lack of a just transition in Scotland, in industrialised Scotland in the 1980s, and so do you think, in terms of the ambition and the focus that we have seen on a just transition for the oil and gas industry, do you think that the Scottish Government is going to be in a position to help bring that just transition into effect, or are we going to be caught between oil and gas companies who are still making a great deal of money, and so I don't think they're under a great deal they will feel under a great deal of compulsion to change, and a Westminster government which a number of ministers whom are well funded by oil majors. Do you think Scotland's going to get caught between oil majors who really don't want to change, and a Westminster government that certainly doesn't want to change?
Yeah, I think we're already caught. I mean, the pincer started there. I believe that most politicians in the Scottish Parliament, and certainly by far most of the Scottish politicians that sit in Westminster, really do believe in a just transition. You have to then break down what that just transition is, because again, it's one of these phrases that gets used all the time. But when you look back at what Nicola Sturgeon talked about growing up in industrial Ayrshire in the 80s. You know, when you look at what happened to the deindustrialisation of Glasgow, Ravenscraig, not far from where I live, that was certainly not just. You can't just pull the rug away from everyone and say, well, do you know what, we have to do this and that's just tough. There you go. You have to look at how best to do things. It can't be done overnight. So when you look at the oil and gas industry, you have to consider how it can be diversified. You also have to recognise, and I'm no expert, I wouldn't pretend to be, but I'm pretty certain that we will still need some level of oil and some level of gas for certain things ongoing. So it's about doing the proper research, recognising where we are, and doing that transition and diversifying into other things. Hydrogen, for example, is something that's been looked at very seriously by the Scottish Government. And I've been to various seminars and have been fascinated about the potential for hydrogen as well as electricity. If we look at electricity and you look at, the push towards electric vehicles, you then recognise that the infrastructure isn't there to sustain all of that. So part of that just transition is the diversifying of skills and talents into other things that are needed. Unfortunately, we can do all the research we like here in Scotland, and we can have all the plans we like. But unless we have the power to actually do something about it, we are stuck. And I have yet to be convinced by the current UK government that they are serious about doing anything about it. I've listened to Boris Johnson's speeches in the few days so far that we've had. I have to say I found it really hard to try and make sense of any of them. One I listened to last night, he was talking about the fall of the Roman Empire or something, and I've really no idea what he was on about. And he just seems to mouth platitudes all the time and just babbles and fills space. So I'm not convinced that the UK government are really serious about any of this. It's all about maintaining popularity as they see it.
That's a very good point. It certainly struck me that when Johnson was addressing the UN Council in New York about 10 days ago and started off talking about Kermit the Frog and the Muppets, and then yesterday morning when he started his speech at COP26 and started talking about James Bond and Ian Fleming and stretched the metaphor well beyond any breaking point. It's an interesting point that you make, that it, and certainly it was commented to me that it appeared that Johnson was talking to his base. He was, it is content free. It is not serious. It is to fill the pages of the Daily Mail.
Politicians have to take hard decisions. Very hard decisions. And if they are truly caring about the people that they have the privilege of serving, truly caring about the future of their nation, they have to take hard decisions. And they may sometimes have to take decisions that they recognise threatens their own position. And I'm not seeing any of that with the UK government, I'm afraid. They are playing all the time, as far as I can see it, to those of whose votes they are not sure of. They know they've got their own level of votes, the die-hard Conservatives. They have a lot of new Conservative voters for all sorts of reasons that we could fill a programme with. And they are being very, very cynical about keeping these folks on board. Hence all the, I'll go as far as to say, lies about Brexit that are still ongoing. Hence all the burying of reality, the manipulation of the press. It's all about their own bigger picture. It's what they want to achieve for the benefit of their core support and using their new support to achieve that. And I wish there was a way we could get that out there and make people see the reality. I wish there was a way we could get Scotland to see that we're on the road to nowhere here and to grasp independence.
Well, it's a very interesting point that you make, and I was thinking, linking that to the point we were making earlier with regard to the just transition. And I'm reminded that last week the Scottish Government was announcing its plans to introduce legislation to pardon minors who were arrested during the strike. It struck me that was perhaps an attempt to deal with the past. And I think I'll ask what you. I'll suggest to you and see what you think. That certainly a section of Scottish society is still probably in shock as a result of what happened in the 1980s and the forced deindustrialisation with no just transition at that time. I think, and so is there a risk that because a section of the population are still in shock about it and are still, as our Scottish Government is still addressing the aftermath of it by pardoning these miners who I know in some cases never worked again in any way, that we'll see a degree of hesitancy or reticence or anxiety about embracing and pursuing a just transition for the oil and gas industry because of Scotland's collective industrial memory of what happened the last time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably something that we do need to be very aware of. And also the communities that were hammered during that deindustrialisation. Cities like Glasgow made a sort of transition through the Year of Culture stuff in 1990, became a different sort of place. Edinburgh coped because of the financial sector. Aberdeen coped because of the oil industry. Dundee took a bit longer to, start to come up to where it is now. But what gets forgotten are the small towns and the small communities in between the cities. And can I say, it's not to say there aren't issues in the cities. Of course there are. There's always folk left behind when change happens. But it's the small towns. I mean, I live in Lanarkshire. I'm very fortunate. I live in rather a nice bit of Lanarkshire. As we judge nice, a fairly well-off bit of Lanarkshire. I'm fortunate. But when you look at the likes of Blantyre, the likes of Motherwell, the likes of Wishaw, places round about that, North Lanarkshire. And, I go to these places quite often. And you can still see the effects of people having been battered down. And I'm getting on a bit, so it's the second and third generations from that. And they're still battered down. Mm-hmm. And when you're battered down, it's very easy to be terrified of any more change because you've had so much taken away from you. You're grasping onto what you still have, and you're really, really frightened that another major change will take that away from you as well. So yes, there is a fear that folk will worry about the just transition and see it as, oh, here we go again, this is going to happen to us again. So we have to inspire confidence in people to get them to recognise that taking their own decisions and truly taking their own decisions, and it should happen at a local level as well as a national level, and there's not enough of that going on, that things can in fact get better for those that come after them. So yes, it's a worry, and yes, there's a lot of work to do.
There were two things that crossed my mind when I was listening to you speaking there. Firstly, there are some parts of cities. I grew up on the south side of Edinburgh, and during the strike saw Mick McGahey every Saturday morning in the newsagents that I deliver papers for. And more to the point now, any time I'm on the south side of the city with my stepchildren, I can point to areas and say, when I was a boy, all of these were pits, and they're now fields. So there's but it also crossed my mind that in the northeast, certainly the fishing industry saw tremendous forced change, and many in the fishing industry ended up working in the offshore sector. So there may be a retained fear of change there. But to make a broader point, do you think that there's a similarity there between the understandable reticence or anxiety regarding change in terms of just transition and what may be what might be described as a justifiable anxiety or a concern about the changes that independence for Scotland would bring? Do you think is it the same or a similar aspect of the Scottish psyche, of the Scottish population, that they are concerned about both those things in a similar sort of way?
I think there are similarities. And I think what was wonderful about the referendum in 2014, the fact that we didn't become independent, it's not so wonderful, but the energising of communities in 2014, I think was fabulous. And But it's also worrying because there was an awful lot of people who grasped on and said, yeah, we can go for this change, we can make things better. People registering to vote in the referendum, the huge high turnout that we had, that was about people who'd felt disenfranchised for a long, long time, who suddenly thought, wait a minute, this can be different. My concern is that they were just battered down again.
Yep.
And that it'll be really difficult to get that level of enthusiasm up again, because it's just like, oh, what was the point? We're never going to win this. Things are never going to change. Same old, same old. That's why I get concerned at people thinking it is so easy just to say, right, we'll have a referendum next week because the opinion polls look good and that'll be it. It's not that simple. First of all, the technicality takes a bit longer than that if you're going to do something legally and orderly and properly that will have the recognition of the international community. But let's not assume that everybody who came out and voted last time will do so again. There's still a lot of work to be done there. And there are communities that have just been hammered so much by the UK over the generations that we have to convince really can do better to do it themselves.
Thanks, Linda. That leads me very nicely to the next item I was going to talk to you about. We're going to talk for another 4 minutes, and then we'll have a short break, and we'll bring in our second guest. But we've got 4 minutes to go yet. So I was going to expand the point. We were thinking and looking at the view of the electorate in Scotland in particular. I know that Boris Johnson, in terms of his description of what he has been saying, or I think he's been saying at COP26 so far, he's described it as global levelling up. Now, we know that levelling up has now entered the common political parlance in the UK. I would argue that it's very difficult to tell what it actually means because it can be it's a perfect political phrase in a sense, because 100 different people will take it to mean 100 different things. So it suits in that sense. We know that there's been criticism in the press this morning of the way in which the levelling up funds in England have been being disbursed, and they appear to be finding themselves predominantly in the hands of conservative in areas which have conservative MPs and which are comparatively well off. I'm thinking in particular of Bedfordshire and Lewis and Sussex, which are two examples today. Do you think that the levelling up phrase is starting to mean things to voters in the UK or voters in England in particular? And do you think will it mean anything at all to other world leaders who are having to sit and listen to Boris Johnson talking at them?
Or not listening.
Or not listening, yes.
Levelling up, yeah, this is the new catchphrase, isn't it? You know, what always strikes me when I hear them talking about it is, see if we really are talking about a just transition. Let's look at the tax system. Let's look at tax avoidance and all the rest of it. And let's do a bit of levelling down. And if we do a bit of levelling down, a bit of levelling up, we might meet in the middle somewhere. But it's just another of these buzz phrases that gets used all the time. I mean, I'm not surprised at the reports about, levelling up funding going to Tory places. The Tories have always done that. Remember, there was a huge Westminster gerrymandering, Westminster area, not the Parliament gerrymandering scandal. Dame Shirley Porter.
Porter, yes.
Yeah, many. In fact, that was one of the first absolute disgusting horrors I had, which made me think of independence. It's that long ago, I think. So it has ever been thus. It doesn't seem to work in Scotland when you look at the carbon capture facility. That's a Tory constituency and promised by one Douglas Ross as well.
I would think so, yes.
Yes. So obviously Scotland doesn't matter. Even the Scottish Tories don't matter to the UK government. It's about what they see as their heartlands and those that they're trying to retain. So I'm very sceptical about the whole levelling up thing, as well as they're trying to bypass devolution by, bribes and more bribes. They're not doing it very well, though. So we'll see. So I can't remember. Oh, yeah, will others internationally recognise it? Levelling up across the world. There was no intention of levelling up across the world. They cut the international development budget. They took it into foreign office and stuff. So, no, not convinced. Next year it'll be a different phrase.
Absolutely. Thanks, Linda. So what we'll do now, we'll have a short break, we'll run a quick video, and then we'll have a further conversation with Linda and with our second guest, Ika Ferrer Gotić, but that'll be after the short video that we're going to run now.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Hello again and welcome back. This is Scotland at 7 and I'm lucky enough now to be joined with a second guest in the studio. We're joined this evening by a friend of the programme who's contributed in the past but is now with us in person. This evening we're joined by Ika Ferrer Gotić, who's a broadcaster and producer and journalist with the broadcaster N1 and a CNN affiliate, I think.
Yes.
Ika, how are you this evening?
Actually very well. A little bit tired. It's been a busy 2 days, to be honest. And of course, the presidential summit that's been going on the 1st and the 2nd of November. It's been tough 2 days, but it wouldn't be possible without the crew of Broadcasting Scotland and Linda Graham. So thank you very much.
Well, we do our best to help, but it's fantastic to see you here. What's your initial impression of the beginning of COP26 that you've seen over the last 48 hours?
First of all, it's really great to see you too in person. We've done shows together before, but it's really good to be here. The impressions are, I'm still getting my impressions under impression, let's say. A lot of people, the organization of COP26 is here and there. There are a couple of breaches where it could get better. We just received the email, all the participants, they're apologizing for the breaches in getting in and getting out and getting to the blue zone and getting live on air or being there virtually. It's been tough. It's been really tough. I actually even didn't have the chance to get to the blue zone today. So we have been broadcasting around the venue the entire time. 120 world leaders were today and yesterday speaking to the United Nations and speaking to the world public. And it was very interesting to hear what they had to say. Every leader had a minute and a half or 2 minutes to say what they had to say, what the plans were of their countries to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and how to keep that 1.5 Celsius situation intact. But the science says something completely different. So we had the Paris Agreement in 2015, and now we have COP26 in 2021. It was supposed to happen last year because of a pandemic and the measures that were really there. We are having it this year. So there's a lot of skepticism of the public and of the activists too, but also among the journalists as well, because we have been hearing these messages over and over again. And the first COP was in 1995 in Berlin. Angela Merkel was hosting COP1. And we have been hearing those messages, I remember, back then. And I was much, much younger then. And now we are here, we're hearing the messages again. I understand it's code red for humanity. I understand the IPCC report said what it had to say, and that the changes are irreversible now. We cannot go back. But we are trying to stay where we are right now. And when you think about that, and when you see what happens across the globe, the fires, the floods, and the air pollution, I mean, is this what is going to be? Is this what we're trying to keep intact, what we're already going through? You know, like I said, science says something differently, and I'm afraid that the promises that we have been hearing in these past 2 days from the world leaders are not really going to be met, even if, like they said, it's code red, and this is it, no way back. Skepticism.
Absolutely. Linda and I were just talking about the both in terms of businesses, but then talking about politicians, and whilst they may be talking the talk, it's whether they're actually able to walk the walk and make it happen. What's your perspective on the prospect, given the context that you've just set, as you say, hearing very similar messaging and very similar proposals over the last the previous 25 COP meetings.
Yes.
What do you think? Do you think the prospects for walking the walk, the prospects for implementing change, do you think they are improving, or are they just stuck at the same?
They have to improve. Whether that's going to happen, now that's the question. We heard all the messages. Now we have to watch them, whether they're going to keep the promises they have given over the course of these 2 days. Walking the walk will take a long time. So we are talking about 2030, 2050, and 2100. Obviously, whatever we are doing here in Glasgow, it's not for us, it is for our children, and it is for the future generations. So I don't really want my children and my grandchildren asking me, okay, what have you done to make it better? So taking part in COP26, even as a journalist, and being completely objective about it, and really knowing the truth and saying the truth, even if it's a hard truth, is very important. So the journalist's role in all this are very important. I know it's hard to stay objective when politicians are in question. And, you know, we all have different feelings about different politicians in every region of the world. And I can understand that. But the promises given, walking the walk will take some time, but we have to watch them. And we have to remind them every once in a while, hey, you promised this. Now you have to do that. And one thing that I really like is the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. He said, okay, so we're not going to wait till COP27 or another 20 years to get together. How about we get those reports every 5 years about the emissions of greenhouse gases in every country before we get together again, and before it's again too late, code red for humanity? How about we start really monitoring the countries, what they're doing across the globe, even if they don't walk the walk, like you said, Andrew. So it's going to be very challenging. We have to remind them. We have to keep reminding them, and we have to educate our children to keep reminding them, whoever is coming after, we are not there anymore. So it's going to be a hard work now. The science is leaving in Glasgow, is staying in Glasgow for the next 10 days, and they are going to make sure they make the estimates whether whatever they said in the past 2 days is actually really reachable, or those are just empty promises.
Thanks, Ika. Linda, one thing that we know is that one of the reasons for COP26 is that the Poorer nations who had been promised $100 billion a year in support have pointed out that they have not been receiving that money. It's something like $80 billion last year. These are very large sums of money, but you'll indulge me. And we know that the World Bank has estimated that it's nearer $4 trillion that's required to be invested with poorer countries around the world who need support to either decarbonise or to continue their economic development in a less harmful manner. Do you think that with that backdrop, do you think that we're seeing politicians begin to stand up and to recognise that they are going to have to deliver on the promises that they're making, and they're going to have to be seen to be implementing, because there's pressure from the UN to come back every 5 years and review the plans for each country to reduce its carbon footprint? Do you think we're getting it? We're now somehow getting to a time where people and institutions are going to hold political leaders to account, or is it going to be more of the same?
I think we're closer. But the question is whether the major players, the people with the power, two things. Do they really believe what they're saying? Or are they saying it because they think it's the thing to say? And even if they do believe what they're saying, do they care? Do they care enough to recognise that it may not just be about them, but it's about future generations, and that every country in the world has to be looked at as part of that globe, because everybody has to be part of it. You can't say, right, we're okay in this bit of the world and we'll just forget about them, because what happens there affects us. You know, when you look at what's happening in the North Pole, the South Pole, if you look at what's happening in the Tibetan Plateau, which is referred to as the third pole, and the amount of people that affects. So when what Ika was talking about the way that we're having weather change, the way that everything's affected, sea levels rising, that then forces migration. You know, we're having an awful lot of discussion that's been not much talked about right now, but it's still there, about the migration of people from different parts of the world to what they perceive as being a better part of the world for whatever reasons. At the moment, it's generally about conflict, but it's going to become about climate change and what that does to their part of the world. And the migration that we've seen so far is nothing compared to what can come unless we absolutely do something. So, as I say, two things. Do they really believe it, or are they just talking? And if they do really believe it, do they really care enough to do something about it? And back to what I said earlier, it requires hard decisions. And I hope that we do have some world leaders that are willing to make hard decisions. And I hope that they are strong enough to pull up or level up those who are not willing to make the hard decisions but end up having to because it's how it looks. So we need some really strong voices to walk the walk.
Absolutely. Thanks, Linda. Ika, there are two things I was going to talk about.
May I just
yes, of course.
continue? I love what you just said. When you said, I'm not really sure if they believe what they said themselves, makes so much sense. I can only take it down to a local level. For example, the countries of the Western Balkans. Are they there to just do their duty, what they're obligated to because they're representatives, because they were elected, or they just did it because, or they really care why they're there? Now, most probable outcome is that first option, that they don't really believe what they're saying, but they're doing their duty because they're obligated to. And you are right, climate change forces migrations, but there's also extinction of different animal species and plant species. So the flora and the fauna are completely different than it was 10 and 20 years ago. So we are having so many problems. You're right, the migration, which is one of the priorities on the list of the priorities, is happening right now in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In my country, we have the migrant route that ends in Bosnia. So we are dealing with thousands of migrants, an influx of the migrants in my country because of climate change, because of war. And yes, when we look at geopolitical situation in every region of the world, in every aspect of the world, we can say yes, the political situation, we see what happened with Afghanistan, war, terrorists taking over, we see what's going on. But there will be a moment in history that only the climate change will be the drive for migration and for everything that we do and the way we live. So I really, really love what you said. I'm not really sure if they believe what they said or we're really there. And yes, we're hoping that we have strong leaders in the world that will make that change, make that impact. But again, I'm maybe more pessimistic about it. Just having seen how it has been handled with the Paris Agreement in 2015, United States, the world power, went out of it, signed out of it with the former President Donald Trump. Why would you do that? Now we see that China, the biggest polluter in the world, was not even present on COP26. And they even announced that they will be extending their program when it comes to carbon dioxide. Why would you do that? The Russian side didn't even want to show up here. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing geopolitical situation that separates us? So is this only a Western project? It looks like to me. Or it concerns the entire world. So, when it comes to, let's make changes like this, it really takes everybody to do that. And not everybody was at the table these 2 days. So that's my concern.
There's some great points there, Rika, and I was going to come to a couple of them. We'll spend another couple of minutes just looking at the migration point, because it is interesting. We know from recent political history in the UK that mass migration is a trigger, is a political tool that was used to mobilise some people to vote for Brexit. We know that migration has been used by similar forces in Hungary, and as you got to the point before I could make it. You also, in terms of Bosnia, migration is an issue there. So the politicians, right-wing politicians, but politicians know that migration is a trigger. It's something that they can use and exploit. Surprise, surprise.
Right.
So how do you think politicians and others are going to react when we see the likely mass migration that's forced by starvation or extreme climate change, or at an even greater level, migration of peoples from, for example, coral islands and atolls in the Pacific Ocean, which will no longer exist if we persist down the path.
Hey, even our neighbors, the Netherlands. We don't have to go that far. We can stay in our neighborhood. It's already happening. It has happened before. So when Netherlands went under the water, it's because of the climate change. 60 years ago, the scientists already warned us about this is about to happen. And we had a first report on global warming. So 60 years ago, we already knew this was happening, and industrialization just kept on going. It kept on going. Even Scotland, Glasgow, I've learned today, was built on the grounds of coal. So we can take that in consideration, stay in our neighborhood. And yes, Bosnia is dealing with influx of migrants for many different reasons. It can be political, can be war, can be starvation, like you said, because of, again, the climate change, because of the shortages of food and water in their places. We've seen that. I've been there. I've been in their camps. I've reported on those issues. I've reported with them. I was standing with them on a very, very cold mountain in the middle of Bosnia with minus 20 degrees Celsius all night without electricity, access to food, and trying to figure out how do we do next, because the influx is so hard and so big that we cannot take care of it. So it comes back to the financing again, even when it comes to migration and even when it comes to climate change. Only Bosnia and Herzegovina will need $17 billion to at least start implementing some of the very ambitious goals that Glasgow has delivered in the past 2 days. I don't know what that number is for other countries in European Union, probably less because we are still in energetic transition somewhere. So we are falling behind. We're not part of European Union, so we don't really comply with some of the laws of the European Union. But of course, as trying to get into candidacy, try to get into European Union, we will have to comply. And yes, so eventually this, what you have mentioned, and this, what Linda, you have mentioned, will eventually be the main reason and probably the only reason why we see migrations. And politicians at this point are using that to get points, to get votes, and then not understanding how it came to that and how to solve that. So I'm seeing the same scenario again. They're saying things that they don't believe themselves, but it looks good, it sounds good, but they're not walking the walk, like you said, Andrew. So I'm trying to create. So I agree.
Absolutely.
I agree. We're not really having some discussion here because we all agree on everything.
We're in raging agreement. Absolutely right. The other point that we were touching on there, Linda, really was round about leadership and political leadership. Now, we know that, and I'll ask you both the same question, but Linda, with you first, we know in the UK, we have learned during the pandemic that we have a Prime Minister who does not take hard decisions. He waits and waits and waits until there is not a decision to be taken. He has to act. And some might say that is also reflected in his style of public speaking, which is content-free and involves Muppets and James Bond and
the Roman Empire.
And the Roman Empire. Yeah. So it's early days in this conference. However, we've had quite a long build-up to it. We have seen a great many world leaders present in Glasgow over the last 2 days for the President's meeting. I'll ask an open question. Is Boris Johnson capable of providing the political leadership that I think it's agreed is required, or is there anybody else that you've seen so far who you think might offer that kind of global leadership?
Oh, an open question.
I love it.
No, I don't
Finally.
I don't think Boris Johnson is capable of being that leader. I don't think he has the concentration, the will, the caring for any of that. I certainly don't see anyone that's jumping out at me in his current government. Though they may be there biding their time. I don't know. Perhaps. I'm not seeing it. Do I see it on the world stage?
I know,
well,
but she's leaving. Angela Merkel.
Angela Merkel, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, what a loss, but we can't expect the woman to go on forever, can we? I look at some countries that we talked about Norway earlier, and some of the small countries. I do think, I don't personally know about their leaders, I don't. But I think some of the things I'm hearing from them, like the Premier of Norway, I think is just so heartening. They're small countries, can't do it on their own, but as we said earlier, if you get a lot of small independent nations together, they can make a big difference. I mean, we're talking about the European Union. It's the small nations in the European Union coming together that are forcing change in the European Union. It's not what the current UK government would have you believe, that Germany made all the decisions. What a pile of nonsense, and that France are just bad people. That is not the case. The small nations are making a difference. So small nations getting together and forcing the hand of the larger nations. Canada. I mean, Canada's got a lot of issues just now. But some
Very
of the stuff,
Very
some of the stuff at the core of the Canadian philosophy is excellent stuff. Trudeau the Younger, he's had his issues as well, but he seems to make hard decisions and stick by them. So there are nations there that can do it. I look at the US, I think Joe Biden, his intentions are pretty good, but he's getting on a bit, we can't expect him to be leading from the front in a way he may have as a younger man. Kamala Harris, I haven't seen enough of her, but what I have seen impresses me. So I think there is potential there for people to come together and force the issues. What I would love to see, of course, is Scotland as one of these small independent nations up front there.
It is. This is how
even in
we
a devolved
see it.
settlement, we're
Well,
helping.
how we see Scotland from outside, I can only tell you that. I do international. I'm head of international desk at N1, and that is for our entire region. So yes, we listen to the leaders, we look at the countries, we look at their leaders, we look at what their policies are, what they're doing, what they're missing to do, what they're noticing, what they're not noticing. And Nicola Sturgeon has proven herself as one of the potential leaders in this fight against climate change. And eventually Scotland, as she said just 2 days ago at the beginning of the summit, I'm sorry, yesterday, it seems like forever to me. I have a feeling I'm here for a very long time because it's been such a lot of work. She has said that Scotland is the leader of green energy, of the wind energy. And that is very impressive. 97% of energy comes from wind. That's better than the Netherlands, which is a wind country. And we see Scotland as a country that can pull those strings for everybody there. So I see Nicola Sturgeon definitely as a leader. She has been very vocal when it comes to all the issues, whether that's COVID, whether that's migrations, and whether that's climate change. She's been very loud. I think probably the loudest PM that I have seen when it came to COP26, definitely. Not just because it's taken place in Glasgow, in Scotland, but generally, even before that, she was very, very loud, and she made sure that she will stand behind all those who will fight against climate change. I love that. So this is how we see Scotland. This is how we see your leaders. There are people in Scotland that can pull those strings. They can do it for the rest of us. I'm very disappointed that Angela Merkel is leaving. She's been a great leader. We remember when the migration influx was coming from Middle East. She accepted 200,000 people in, but nobody was under any impression that the security was a breach in security, or nobody was afraid of losing their job because to migrants, or the social politics was really in place, intact. She's done a great job, and she's always been very vocal about climate change as well. So there are leaders in Europe and European Union that can do that. However, of course, I'm just afraid that when COP26 is over, we will go back to those standard political issues that we have with each other and forget what we have promised. Like I said again, we have to keep reminding them what they promised us, and this must not be forgotten. So from now, because they had 2 days to say what they had to say, they had their meetings together. When we go back home, we will ask him again. How are you going to do that? When are you going to do that? How are you going to secure finances to do that? And how do we move forward together? We're not going to talk about politics like we used to do. We're not going to do that. Absolutely not. So, but yes, Scotland is seen in a very, very positive light from outside. I think it was important for me to tell you guys, you're doing really great. And well, let me tell you that I think mentality is very, very close to the Bosnian, and I have never seen this level of hospitality in the world. I feel home in Scotland. Thank you so much for hosting me here. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
We'll need to go and visit her in Bosnia.
Then we host you, and you will know what I'm talking about.
It's been too long since I've been in Bosnia, but I do recall certainly the diet being very, very amenable to those of a Scottish persuasion. I'll say no more than that. But it's an interesting point that Rika makes, Linda. In terms of as I said, one of the reasons for COP26 is to begin to try and make sure that those who signed up to the Paris Accord and previous agreements actually deliver on what they said that they would do. And it's apparent that one of the purposes in COP26 is to allow the smaller nations to seek to force and to seek to increase pressure on the larger nations, the wealthier nations, to meet the obligations that they said they would. Do you think the United Nations has tremendous strengths, and to be charitable, because it is populated by people, it has tremendous weaknesses as well? So in terms of if this is a climate emergency, if this is code red, is it possible that the United Nations is going to be able to step up and to, by diplomatic means only, to encourage and to seek to persuade, to cajole, to embarrass nations to do what they said they would do, both in terms of financial contributions and in terms of reducing carbon footprints and reducing emissions? Do you think the United Nations is going to be able to do that, or do we need a different world policeman, or what do you think are the institutional options to try and make sure that countries do what they said they would do?
Well, there's not an awful lot of institutional options. I mean, the United Nations can do what they can and try and pull people together. And Gotić is, I actually think he is very sincere in what he's trying to do. But if you do have a world of nation states, at the end of the day, most of it's voluntary. I mean, I know that Russia and China signed up today to deforestation. Yeah. But it's voluntary. Can nations be shamed into doing the right thing? Because often that's what it takes. Will other nations that have influence, like the big players, will they seriously impose some kind of sanction on those that don't meet? So it's up to the individual players in the United Nations to come together to try and force the rogue states, to use the term, to actually act properly. Because we don't have a world police. And thank goodness for that. We don't actually want anything like that. So it's about enough people having the will to become the majority doing the right thing and being willing to do fairly hard things to others who are not doing the right thing. I think that's what it's going to take. And yes, I'm delighted to hear Ika talking about Nicola Sturgeon as our First Minister, the respect she has, and how well Scotland's doing. And I'm filled with pride at all of that. But the reality is, because we're not independent and because we're in the nation state of the UK, how good Scotland is doing tends to get buried in the overall UK figures. So it's only those like Ika who are looking at this stuff really seriously that manage to pick that up. But I mean, I read something yesterday that Nicola Sturgeon had put out about how Scotland's doing, mentioning the 97%, and we've got plenty of wind, that's for sure. We've got plenty of water, and it's very heartening. We're doing so very much, and it just doesn't get out there. I wish that some of our own newspapers and media outlets, mainstream media outlets, would actually push the good news, because they don't.
It gets out there.
Yes,
yeah. Yes, it does. Yeah,
absolutely.
That surprises me. That saddens me, actually, because the voice of Nicola Sturgeon is heard very far. Very far.
Our media is largely owned outside of Scotland, which is one of the problems. But Ika, I was just thinking there in the context of the UN with thinking of your upbringing and your background. You've seen the UN operating at the sharp
end. That's what I wanted to say just now.
You've seen the highs and the lows of the UN and of operations that are organised by the UN in very difficult situations. What do you think that there could be or should be or are institutions or other bodies which can assist us all in holding politicians to their promises and the things that they've said that they'll do?
I would agree with Linda. There is not much institutional, let's say, the institutional body that can really do that. This is a summit of United Nations. So they should hold governments, countries accountable for not doing what they were supposed to do. But I'm afraid that really doesn't happen much either. So if I take the reference, what you just mentioned, back to the 90s, when my family was expelled from our home in 92, we became migrants ourselves. And refugees, actually. And I came back to Bosnia in 2011, so that's just 10 years ago, and discovered that it's a beautiful country. And I started learning about the history because I was a child when we had to leave. It took 4 years for war to end because United Nations did not act on time. So it took us 11,700 people being shot in Sarajevo, in a modern city in middle of Europe. It took us more than 8,000 people being slaughtered in genocide in Srebrenica. 200,000 people in total killed over Bosnia, and 2.2 million displaced out of the country, which I was one of them as well. So the trust in United Nations as an institutional body is very low in my region, and in some European countries as well. And we can only see that everything good that is happening, that United Nations come up with, you will always have veto from Russia, or somebody else will veto good decisions. And that has been happening in my region, and we really have the feel of how United Nations are not together on board when it comes to certain very important decisions, when it comes to lives of people in my region. Now, 25 years or 26 years after the war, we are talking about war again. We are talking about dissolution of the country that once was in war. So we're going back to the 90s again. And then we had United Nations Security Assembly. They were supposed to discuss Bosnia, and then there was Russia, put veto in, it was over. So is it that easy to not have the institutional body that will really regulate what's going on in the world? So if they cannot regulate what's going on in countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, when it comes to human life and loss of human life, will they be able then to get on board and regulate climate change? That actually around the world we still have a lot of people don't even believe in it. There are still skepticism over whether climate change is even real. We had American president that didn't believe in climate change, couldn't tell the difference between climate change and weather. And the list goes on and list goes on. So the trust in United Nations, if you mention United Nations anywhere in our region, is just rolling eyes. Oh, yeah, right. So there is not much trust, but this is United Nations summit. It's their summit, climate summit. So if this is the 26th, so we had 26 of these summits, and we are talking about Code Red for Humanity. What have you done 25 summits ago? So we got ourselves to Code Red for Humanity. Where is that institutional body? Where is your authority? Those are the facts. We can discuss whatever we want. We like it, we don't like it, but the facts come first, and the facts, they say something completely different. So this is why there's a lot of skepticism over what's been said, and with a good reason.
Thanks, Ika.
You're welcome.
I'm going to think, we'll talk now a little bit about other world leaders, but also I want to do that by going to, this is a terrible metaphor, I'd like to look at this from the other end of the telescope here. We've been talking about institutions and world leaders. To talk about the impact on people, I will talk very briefly about world leaders. I think 4 of the island nations of the Pacific are sending their prime ministers to COP26 in Glasgow. I think Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Tuvalu and Palau have sent their prime ministers. Now, the Prime Minister of Palau was speaking at lunchtime today and was, I don't have the quote in front of me, but I'll paraphrase him. He was saying that the suffering that the people of Palau that will be forced upon the people of Palau is such, the destruction of our environment, the destruction of their lives is such that he would rather that they were bombed and killed now. And the Prime Minister of Fiji similarly had said, I have his quote here, he says, our sovereignty and our very survival are at stake. And that this could be the final opportunity to keep to the 1.5 degree limit. So Linda, in terms of thinking of island nations or thinking about implications on people again, do you think that the voices of small nations, the voices of the leaders of small nations are going to be heard and are going to be acted upon as a result of the discussions at COP26?
No. Hate to be so pessimistic, but these nations are so small. And if you look at the major players, in their part of the world? Well, it's Australia. And Australia does not have a good record right now in terms of taking any of this seriously. So I think that is really concerning for these small nations. I mean, some of these smaller Pacific nations are not hugely poor. What's facing them is absolutely the climate change disaster that is going to do away with their environment and just make it disappear in some cases, which is just, we hear...
catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean, we hear reports of bits of the land disappearing, and, there used to be a village there and it's not anymore. But this is an entire nation. So, no, I think that Australia and the other large nations' answer to some of this will be evacuation. I think that's what they'll look for. Because I don't...
Loss of life.
There will be loss of
for
life.
Sure.
And the whole effect, Ika, you raised it earlier, about animals, flora, fauna, the whole biosystem is going to be affected by this too. So for these poor people and what they're facing, I am not convinced that others will step up to help necessarily.
It crosses my mind that, and this is not directly important, it does cross my mind that the UK and US have history in the Indian Ocean of depopulating places.
Yes.
The Chagosians eventually won in the courts, but
they're still not going home.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
It's awful.
So we have a difficult track record there as well. I think you were talking before that you'd been discussing also with people from Timor. Their experience. Now Timor's not a coral atoll, so has different issues. But what were they telling you when you were speaking to them?
Well, I mean, it's just generally, I mean, it's a country that I have, quite big ties with, so I am aware of what's going on there. I'm talking about East Timor here, Timor-Leste. The other half of the island, for those that are unaware, is part of Indonesia, West Timor. There was a big independence struggle there, which was won, and the country became independent at the start of this century. But the reason they were occupied so long and were not helped by the world was because of their oil reserves. So now you have this small, tiny little new nation with all these oil reserves who, I have to say, haven't quite got it together yet with what they're doing. But new nations generally have these issues if they come out of conflict situation. So there is a small country that we really should be looking at for just transition, if we're serious about having a just transition, because they've been banking everything on, having this oil industry, and now they're being told, well, you can't have that anymore. So it's that's very simplistic, but that's where we're at. So there has to be something done for the likes of Timor, and perhaps if world leaders of the larger nations were really serious about just transition, they would look at that region as a whole and say, well, here we are, we have these Pacific atolls and coral islands that are under real danger. We have a potentially very rich small nation here. Let's look at the region as a whole. I mean, they do have their own institution, which is ASEAN. Timor's not a member yet. But, discussions with United Nations and ASEAN and the nations that are involved. Let's look at this region. And we have to look at it economically. Most important of all, we have to look at it for the lives of people and how we best work on this. Let's save these islands. It's so very, very important. And, hard decisions. Back to hard decisions. And the will to do it and the belief in doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linda.
Beautiful.
We're coming towards the end of day 2 of COP26, and there have been a number of announcements that have been made, and we'll maybe talk about those for a couple of minutes, if I may. I'm thinking in particular with regard to the announcement yesterday of agreement between nations with regard to halting deforestation and beginning the process of reforestation, and then secondly, we can perhaps talk a little bit about the announcement led by Joe Biden this morning with regard to the methane. The release of methane into the atmosphere as a very significant cause of global warming. But we'll look at deforestation and reforestation first, and I've got a press release here from the Scottish Green Party saying that the deal to end and reverse deforestation by 2030, announced at COP, is just the beginning of what is needed to restore nature. Commenting, Mark Ruskell said, "This is an urgently needed and necessary deal, and it is significant that Brazil has signed it, but it must be turned into action. The loss of the world's forests has had a devastating impact on both carbon stores and wildlife, and previous declarations have not led to the action needed." And then they go on to talk about the Scottish Greens and government increasing the reforestation targets in Scotland. And we know that Scotland has been planting more than 80% of all of the trees planted in the British Isles over the last few, in each of the last few years. But firstly, Ika, from your perspective, do you think that the announcement of this agreement, and a widespread agreement, including nations which are either not represented here by their presidents or their leaders, or nations who might be regarded as taking a slightly more sceptical or relaxed approach to these things. Do you think that this deal has the chance of sticking? Do you think
I don't think the deal has a chance of sticking. It's very accidental that I have spoken to the president of the coalition for forests by United Nations, Federica Bieta, just the day before I boarded on the flight to Glasgow. And she has told me that the government of United Kingdom, so the Prime Minister, said that he will put out an announcement on behalf of United Kingdom when it comes to forests, and that it was completely off what Paris Agreement in 2015 and the agreement of Redex in 2005, it does not comply with the agreements at all. So she had a very, very serious criticism towards Boris Johnson that the announcement that he was about to put in, which he did do yesterday and today, on today's Day of Forests, International Day of Forests, do not comply when it comes to financing. So cutting off financing and saying we are going to finance, but it does not comply with the agreement. So this is why I'm very skeptic again about all the messages that are put out there. When it comes to deforestation, we have seen what happened in Brazil just 2 years ago and 5 years ago, and how it happened, and how really everybody, we were all I can tell you out of my perspective as a journalist, we were all reporting on it, and we were all calling for action, because loss of wildlife, loss of human life there, and loss of the lungs of Earth. It was just happening before our eyes. Of course, oceans and the forests are the lungs of the Earth. Just being completely devastated in front of our eyes. Nobody did anything. Nobody did, and that was code red for forests. Nobody did anything. So calling for action, activists calling for action, people screaming at United Nations, at the institutions in Brazil, institutions in the United States, asking for help. Nothing happened at all. And that was really a crucial moment to see whether the forests are really #1 priority on our list when it comes to climate change. And this was all caused by climate change and the human factor. And we have to take the human factor as well in count. So how educated are we when it comes to our forests, our lungs, and our oceans, and again, our environment in general? We're not really investing. We're not doing the reforms fast enough in the world. So again, I'm skeptic, very pessimistic about the announcement made. Those announcements have been made before by different leaders. Nothing happened again. And knowing that Scotland is planting trees so fast and so much, again, it's a wow for the world. Thank you for that.
Well, we'll see.
We have to do more.
But your point about understanding is a good one. I'm reminded somebody was suggesting that Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos should put up a large amount of money for someone to encourage somebody to invent a device that captures carbon and stores it. To which the response was, "That's a tree."
May I just add something to that? I'm sorry. When you mentioned Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, first of all, I completely adore Elon Musk. He's a complete eccentric. Nobody understands him. Great innovations are there. We're doing everything, but I hate the skepticism towards him so much. Oh, why is he looking for a planet to go to while he can do so much here? But he is already, and this is what people don't know. He's taken half of his wealth and putting it into climate-related problems on Earth. Nobody knows that. He doesn't really go out and say, well, I just took half of my... He doesn't do that. But also there's this point which is really important. I debate this over and over with my colleagues and in the program and off program. Why would Elon Musk should be held accountable to save the planet while we have all these governments we voted for and they're receiving our money?
Absolutely.
Why are we relying on a billionaire that made his money on his own and he's a civilian? So we should rely on our governments. This is where we should look for accountability and responsibility, not in Elon Musk. I think what he's doing is great and we probably will need another planet to go to. So thank you, Elon.
That's a good point. But in thinking about responsibility and accountability, in thinking about this apparent plan to halt deforestation and to encourage reforestation, everyone has remarked that Brazil has apparently agreed to this deal. Given the nature of right-wing populist politicians and self-styled hard men and science deniers, President Bolsonaro.
Flat earthers.
I'm looking at President Bolsonaro. I'm looking at you. Do you think that there is a prospect of this deal being put into effect in Brazil?
No. Well, China and Russia have also signed it,
Exactly.
And it's entirely voluntary. There's no sanctions. And when you look at, I mean, the way Brazil has just wantonly decimated, more than decimated, in fact, their forests. And I mean, see, Mark Russell's press release is right. What's been taken away in the wildlife, but it's also the people. See the people that have been displaced by that. Horrendous. And sometimes displaced in the meanest of ways. Awful. And when you look at the industry that is palm oil, and no, I don't see a prospect of it. I wish I did, but I don't. And what are they going to replace it with? How do you actually replace the Amazonian rainforest?
Well, you don't.
What, pine trees? It starts to all become very, very simplistic, doesn't it? It's just something that's said because it sounds rather good.
Yeah.
And let's all sign up to it. I'm sure there are those that will take it seriously. Scotland's government takes it very, very seriously. I know that, in like the Scandinavian countries, again, they take it very, very seriously. And there'll be other countries in the world that do as well. I'm not convinced that Russia, China or Brazil will take it particularly seriously.
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. China is, like we said, first of all, as most people in the world live in China. Yeah. So 1.6 billion people live in China. So that's the biggest nation in the world not taking things seriously. That's very concerning. So it's great if Scotland or Scandinavian countries or even Bosnia and Herzegovina or smaller countries take it seriously. But if China, Russia, Brazil does not take it seriously, we are really lost. When it comes to, you mentioned before, oil countries and how they should manage that. Unfortunately, we still see in the world when it comes to oil-rich countries, they become enslaved. Oil-rich nations become enslaved. We have seen that in Iraq, we have seen it in Afghanistan, we have seen that around Middle East, we have seen it in Indonesia. Enslaving of Venezuela was attempted, it failed. This is why they have so many sanctions, because they didn't let to become an enslaved nation. So we see that. So I'm afraid that anywhere where fossil fuels still are, where it could be produced cheap, the nations will be enslaved. Unfortunately, we were witnesses of what happened in Afghanistan after the mission was over, 20-year-long mission, after all the resources were taken. Now, Iraq is also probably at the end of the year. We see slowly pulling out. Libya completely destroyed now, and it used to be a wealthy country.
But you know, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. Back to that earlier discussion.
Yes.
You've got to keep trying. And while there are people trying, and while there are people with hope, things are better than if everyone gives up. And I know everything you said is absolutely right, but let's look at Norway, an oil-rich nation that's done rather well and is giving back. And that's surely what we should all be aiming for, is doing rather well yourself and not just battening down the hatches and saying, I'm all right, Jack, but giving back.
What do you think, Linda, is difference? Oh, now I'm taking the journalist position. I'm so sorry, it's a habit.
Don't apologize.
It's a professional deformation. What do you think that Norway has in mentality differently to be oil-rich country but still give back and go to green energy? But other countries don't. What do you think is the difference between Norway and other countries like United States and some European countries? What is the difference? Why are they so different and so responsible we are not?
Well, I think when they discovered the oil, it was a bit of a bonus because they were actually doing all right anyway. You know, Norway was doing fine. It's like Scotland would be. I always thought that Scotland had control of its oil. It was a bonus. It didn't replace everything. It wasn't all we needed. So Norway set up their oil fund and said, this is for the future of our country. And it became much more successful than they would ever have thought. They're now able to give something back. And they also have a very sort of egalitarian, collective way of looking at things. You know, critics of Norway in this country that say, oh, we don't want to be Norway. Really, actually, wouldn't mind being Norway. You know, but they say that because there's a mentality amongst some in this country, as there is in the US and other places, that you should be low taxed, you shouldn't have to pay tax. If you get this, you're entitled to keep it. Norway has a high tax system and a very, very collective way of looking at things. So that's a basic difference. But I think when you look at countries, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, some of the Arabic nations and other places that have found oil, you had a huge degree of poverty.
Yes.
And all of a sudden it became very rich. And those that had the power to run the country and run the resources became richest of all and then used it to enslave. I think the US is a whole different thing. That's about... the United States isn't just like one country. It's got all the different states who behave very differently. So you had the likes of Texas that became the really oil-rich one. And Texas has always considered itself an independent nation within the US anyway.
Oh, yes.
So I think there's differences in every scenario as to how it worked. But Norway, I think, is something to hold up as a model of how things should be. I mean, they do have issues. Of course they have issues. But generally, they're doing all right and do it rather well, I think.
Yeah, we should be all Norway.
Yeah.
Thank you. What we'll do is, I mentioned methane. I think what we'll do instead is we'll move on to another topic that, particularly because we're lucky enough to have both of you here this evening.
Thank you.
And that's that a statement calling for the role of women and girls to be advanced in addressing climate change has been launched at COP26 and is jointly sponsored by the Scottish Government. The Glasgow Women's Leadership Statement on Gender Equality and Climate Change commits to further strengthening efforts to support women and girls to lead on addressing climate change at community, national and international level. It recognises that women and girls are often disproportionately affected by climate change and face greater risks and burdens from its impacts, particularly in situations of poverty. Drafted in cooperation with the United Nations Women, the statement was launched following a panel discussion convened by our First Minister, which included the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, the President of Tanzania, Samia Suluhu Hassan, and the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas. The First Minister said, "I'm delighted to convene the Glasgow Women's Leadership Initiative with the UN Women to put gender equality and climate change at the very forefront of COP26. One of the great injustices of the climate crisis is that the people in countries who are worst affected are those who have contributed least to its causes. That includes women and girls, with girls more likely to be taken out of school and women less able to find alternative forms of employment as a result of climate impacts. The Glasgow Statement recognises that the leadership of women and girls is essential to ensure global efforts to tackle climate change succeed. With strong partnerships between governments and civil society, we can enable more women and girls to lead on the solutions we need to address climate impacts and promote gender equality. I'm determined that Scotland will lead on progressing this at home and internationally where we can, and I call on all leaders to join me in signing up to the statement. Now, we've spoken a little bit about Nicola Sturgeon's profile on the world stage. I'm reminded, of course, that yesterday morning we were delighted to see Nicola Sturgeon sitting down with Greta Thunberg at the beginning of this conference, and clearly two women who are leading in the context of our local politics and in terms of the international response to the climate crisis. So do you, Linda, first of all, with, as I say, in terms of what I could see yesterday, two very successful and very impactful women leaders in their own ways, talking and meeting together. Do you think that there is this statement calling for the role of women and girls to be advanced in addressing climate change? Is it required, or is it simply going to amplify the impact and the success which Nicola Sturgeon and Greta Thunberg have been having in raising this issue?
Mm-hmm. Right, okay. I'm going to mention a third very important woman in this, which is the leader of Glasgow City Council, Susan Aitken. She made a cracking speech yesterday. I thought she was super. And she's been getting a lot of stick lately, but I think she's done a great job in pulling Glasgow together and having Glasgow as the host city. And I'm pretty sure she'll be involved in this initiative as well, if I know her. I'm really pleased to hear that. First I heard of it, Andrew. It sounds really good to me. And the reality is that in all these situations, women are affected most badly, especially in developing nations. And, you know, I think Nicola said there about girls are first to get taken out of school, women are first to lose work. Women tend to be the ones, if a family breaks down, women are the ones that are left carrying the can so often. So the thing is what we do with it. What do we do with it? It's all very well making statements and big conferences and meetings of United Nations, European Union. All these institutions love to make statements and sign them off. Nicola's not guilty of that. She tends to put that into action. I think young Greta Thunberg is not one to not try and hold people to account when something's done. And as I say, I'm sure Susan Aitken will be involved as well. I actually, a few years ago, was involved in a young women's initiative, and I ended up having a meeting with United Nations about the role of women. And I was quite fascinated by some of the things they told me about the particular difficulties for women in poorer nations. I knew a lot of it, we all know a lot of it, but these people were getting right down to the nitty-gritty of how women were affected by so much. Very, very basic things, like lack of education, meaning that they just didn't know what to do and just sat back and accepted the inexorable fate of what was coming. Things like women not being, or girls not being involved in sport, for example, or in play, therefore didn't know how to run away if something bad came. It was very, very basic things. And if we get away from all the high talk and fancy language and start looking at the basics and teaching women in communities how to prepare for things, there's always things they're never going to deal with, let's face it. My goodness, you know that more than MD. But, you know, if we can make a small difference in the lives of some, let's do it at that level, not up here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Linda. And Anika, we've been talking probably far too much about populist, right-wing, hard men, male politicians already this evening, and their ability or inability to deliver, or their determination or not to deliver on the promises that they are making. Do you think that this announcement with regard to focusing on gender equality and climate change, do you think that this might encourage others to think a little bit more carefully about the gender aspects of the climate crisis and what we're about to face?
I'm very, very surprised that this topic of gender equality was put in the context of climate change and how women should lead. But gender equality and rights of women should be put in every context of every aspect of our life. When it comes to that, I'm a little bit more optimistic because we see that women leaders are showing up, literally popping up around the world, that they're very inspiring. We have Malala, who fought for education of girls in her country. Then we had, of course, when we looked at the most recent events in Afghanistan, we see what happened to women when Taliban took over. Women were not allowed to go back to school. They were not allowed to work. They were not allowed. They didn't have access to education, to work, to anything to do. And we have evacuated some women out of Afghanistan. They thrive. They thrive so fast and so much, and it's very inspiring to see. So putting women gender equality in context of climate change, I absolutely love it. Now we have Nicola Sturgeon. You mentioned Greta Thunberg. She's been amazing, a very eloquent young woman who inspired me too, to be really climate educated and be really focused on what real issues are. So I did put some politics aside in order to, because she did inspire me to learn more and educate myself more about climate change. Now, people like that, girls like that, women like that can inspire nations wide. And yes, I'm very optimistic because we really see really good women coming up. And if we like say what you said, Linda, leave the fancy talk aside and go to the local levels and see how that is implemented. I have to mention Marie Todd, MP. Marie Todd, I love Marie. Marie was in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She went to Srebrenica. She met with mothers of Srebrenica. She came to my studio. And she at that time, she was a minister for education and children. And she promised me that the genocide that happened in Bosnia will be implemented in education in Scotland, and that Scotland would talk more and learn more from the lessons of genocide. She did that. Yeah. She did that. So that's leadership. She's a woman. She's a very, very mighty woman. And seeing women like that's very inspiring. And in Bosnia, for example, very small nation, 3.5 million people only, nation that is still in development. We can see really strong women coming to the light finally, and that's very also inspiring. They have a voice, that they are determined, and they are much better leaders. Because when we talk about hard men and hard talk and hard leaders, we've been only seeing men just having wars with each other and nations being enslaved and in war. We need more women, because women have the sensibility to understand what happens to women in the sense of war or climate change, what happens to them. I have a feeling that there are a lot, of course, there are a lot of men, they usually call them feminists. They don't have to be a feminist to understand the gender equality. They don't even like the word. I don't like the word feminist. What does that mean? Do I only push this certain thing because somebody's a woman? No. If you have an eloquent woman in front of you, she should be given a chance to speak. And you don't have to be a feminist to do that. So you just have to be a reasonable person. And there are men around us that support that do that. And women cannot do it without men, because men are still generally in power. It depends on them, who they choose, how they want to choose. So I think we have to educate men in order to give eloquent women the chance to lead, to be those who should lead not just the nations, but even smaller communities. So I'm very optimistic about this summit.
Well, that's good, and we're lucky enough to have two very eloquent women joining us this evening and making this program and making these contributions. Ika, I was reminded to the context of what you were just saying to ask you about the mayor of Sarajevo in terms of women in politics.
Benjamina Karic.
Yes.
She's our first woman mayor of Sarajevo. She's young. I think she's even younger than me. She's very fresh. She has really great ideas, and just taking in consideration that we still have some national questions, because there are 3 constituents in Bosnia. We have minorities. that are not still having their rights for certain politicians, politics, places. She's been very, very considerate towards everybody who lives there, and she's been doing great for our city. Of course, she will face some backlash because she's a woman, and usually when you have women like that, when you have people that disagree with her just because she comes from a certain political party, they will immediately, because they have in lack of arguments, they will attack you personally. And that's what has been happening. But she has been carrying that weight on her shoulders so well without being shook at all. So that's very inspiring too. But it's also a way to tell the girls, hey, you can be whatever you want. You can be a scientist, you can be a mayor of a beautiful city, you can be a president eventually. So she did inspire a lot of women. She did inspire me as well. So yes, I'm very, very proud that the mayor of my city is a woman.
Another eloquent and successful female politician.
Absolutely.
I'm sure we'll learn more. Now, there's one more thing I was going to talk to you both about this evening. Now, we know that the presidential meeting is coming to an end, and we know that a number of presidents and politicians have already left. I think Emmanuel Macron left a little while ago. And we know that Boris Johnson will be leaving Glasgow in a little while and has decided that he wants to fly back to London. Now, after the budget last week and the cut in the air passenger duty in an attempt to encourage short-haul flights in the UK, apparently, and in the context that we have, we do have railways, and we do still have railways in the UK, and it is possible to travel by rail from Glasgow Central to London. And notwithstanding that Downing Street have defended this decision, saying that the aircraft that he's using uses sustainable aviation fuel.
Oh, please.
And I have no idea what sustainable
Please.
aviation fuel is. It sounds like
Let's
a
save the
contradiction
planet,
in
but let's
terms-
pump up as much as CO2 in the atmosphere. Come on.
So in terms of Mr. Johnson's decision to fly back to London from Glasgow tonight, is it that he's under such pressure of time because he's such a hard worker and his diary's full of everything he needs to be doing, or is it the risk of being might there be a woman at the far end that he's desperate to get back to, or does he just not care, or is there something else on the go? What do you think, Linda?
I've got no idea. I mean, there's nothing that man does that has any logic for me whatsoever. Maybe the plane's flying in chip shop used oil or something from Maryhill. I don't know. The man, I just wish he would fly away.
Well, that's absolutely.
Give him a pair of wax wings like Icarus and send him to the sun. I don't know.
But this is just a reason to have that skepticism over what they have been saying. I mean, if you are flying and you come here and you give remarks, and I'm just saying journalistically, I'm not biased at all.
Yeah.
I really don't care who he is or what he does or. But if you are here, a host of United Nations Climate Summit, and you decide to fly, and you say it's sustainable fuel, what are you, on a rocket of Elon Musk? You use hydrogen? It's unlikely. So you're just showing the world that you're not really serious. Like you said, Linda, you don't even believe what you're saying yourself. And it's not just Boris Johnson. There have been a lot of other leaders that came to Climate Summit on a private jet. So this is why so much skepticism there is. And Greta Thunberg also said that they are not just, well, I'll use her words, those are not my words, they're liars, but also they betrayed the entire nations by their actions and their words. They say words, but the actions speak differently. That's what Boris Johnson did, obviously.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ika.
Absolutely, thank you.
No, I think that's been a fantastic conversation this evening. Thank you both for your time and your contributions.
Thank you. I loved it with you guys. Thank you, Andrew.
Yes,
No, it's been a
thank you,
pleasure.
Andrew.
Pleasure.
So eloquent a man.
Oh my, you'll never get
Yes,
my
he is.
studio.
He will never accept a compliment. So bad with compliments.
Absolutely
Okay.
not. There are, however, three things that I need to do just now. Firstly, I need to say that people value the particular approach which Broadcasting Scotland takes to news, current affairs and culture, and we rely upon the support of those people who value the work that we do here. And so you will see on the screen now a website, and if you would like to support us, and we would really like you to support us, then please consider donating or subscribing to Broadcasting Scotland and supporting the work that we do. Secondly, there's another way in which you can assist us. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either in front of the cameras or behind the scenes or in any other way that promotes the station and the work that we do here, then please go to our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. The third thing that I need to do is to thank Linda Fabiani and to thank Ferrer Gotić for joining us this evening and for contributing over a long conversation on what are some very wide-ranging but some very important topics. So thank you both very much for your time this evening.
Pleasure, thank you.
So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Thank you very much for watching us this evening. Have a very good evening.